3,000 years ago, before heaven and hell became household words, before salvation and sin carved the afterlife into clear lines, there was Greece. Not the postcard Greece of whitewashed islands and tourist beaches, but a raw, unpredictable land of city-states and warring gods, where life was fragile and death, terrifyingly ordinary, sat just beyond the firelight. Imagine living in a world where a single fever could carry you away, where a sailor might vanish beneath a black Aegean storm without prayer or warning, where war was a seasonal occupation and graveyards multiplied with every campaign. What comfort did the living have? What promise waited for them beyond the grave? If you think the ancient Greeks pictured death as a simple binary, good people up, bad people down, you're in for a shock. Their afterlife was stranger, murkier, and in many ways far more unsettling. No pearly gates, no eternal reward for virtue, no fiery pit reserved for evildoers. For most mortals, the great hereafter was a shadowy flatland called Hades, a realm of silence and half-memory where you existed, but barely. A place where identity thinned like smoke, where the heroic and the humble shared the same grey fate. The most frightening part? This was not punishment. It was just what happened when you died. And yet, from this bleak vision grew some of the most powerful myths ever told. Myths that shaped Western ideas of the soul, of justice, of what it means to live well knowing death is inevitable. Because while the ordinary Greek expected little more than a ghostly half-life, the poets and priests carved out paths of hope, secret rites that promised a better fate, philosophies that dared to say the soul might transcend this shadow world, and heroes who defied the laws of death itself. Achilles, Orpheus, Odysseus. They were not just warriors and lovers. They were explorers of the ultimate unknown. Before we go further, pause and ask yourself, if you lived in a world where the afterlife was mostly gray and meaningless, what would you do to give life meaning? Would you cling to glory, hoping your name would echo long after your body rotted? Would you seek secret knowledge, a ritual that might bend the rules of eternity? Or would you accept the darkness and live fiercely for the here and now? The Greeks asked all these questions, and their answers changed over centuries, shaped by war, by philosophy, by poetry, and by the slow birth of ideas we still wrestle with today. But the story doesn't begin with Plato or grand temples. It starts in the deep past, in the smoky Bronze Age, when wandering bards told tales of heroes and gods to kings and warriors. Homer's Odyssey gives us our first great tour of the Greek underworld, and it's not a place you'd want to visit. Odysseus, desperate to find his way home, sails to the edge of the living world and digs a trench in the black earth. He pours libations of honey, milk, wine, and blood, calling the dead to rise. And they do, shades by the hundreds, whispering, moaning, hungering for the taste of life they've lost. Even the great Achilles, the most glorious warrior of the Trojan War, appears not as a triumphant spirit but as a weary ghost. He tells Odysseus, "Do not try to comfort me about death. I would rather be a hired hand to a poor farmer on earth than lord of all the dead in Hades." Imagine hearing that from the man who once chose death in glory over a long, obscure life. In Homer's world, death strips away everything. Homer's underworld is ruled by Hades and his queen Persephone, but don't picture a fiery Satan or a torturer of sinners. Hades is more bureaucrat than devil, cold, inevitable, unbending, but not sadistic. His realm is where all souls go, whether king or slave. It's dark, damp, and joyless. A few areas are set apart. The Elysian fields, where a tiny handful of demigods and great heroes find peace. And the deeper pits of Tartarus, where cosmic criminals like the Titans are chained. But these are exceptions, not the rule. The average Greek could expect no heaven, no true hell. Just eternity as a shade among countless others. This grim vision shaped how early Greeks lived. If death meant oblivion, then the only immortality worth chasing was kleos, glory, the undying reputation sung by poets. To die young but be remembered forever was better than to live long and fade into nameless shadow. Achilles' famous choice between a long quiet life and a short glorious one reflects this calculus. Heroes weren't just fighting wars. They were fighting death itself by making sure their names survived it. But this was only the beginning. Over the centuries, the Greek view of the afterlife evolved. Mystery cults arose, secret religious movements that whispered of better fates for those who were initiated. The most famous, the Eleusinian Mysteries, promised a gentler afterlife for those who underwent its rites. Tragedy and philosophy questioned whether death was an evil at all. And by the time of Plato, new ideas of the soul emerged. that it might be immortal, that life was a test, that death could mean liberation rather than loss. The journey from Homer's bleak shadows to Plato's immortal soul is one of the most fascinating transformations in Western thought. It's a journey we'll take step by step. We'll see how ordinary funerals and ghost stories met high philosophy, how the cult of Dionysus and the Orphics offered salvation to those desperate for meaning, how the Greeks wrestled with fate, justice, and the terror of non-existence, and how, in the end, their many visions of the afterlife still echo whenever we wonder what happens when we die. For now, remember Achilles' lament. The greatest warrior of the age would rather scrub floors for a peasant than rule over the dead. That's where our story begins. In a world where death offers no comfort, no reward, only the endless twilight of Hades. Everything the Greeks built on top of that fear, the rituals, the philosophies, the acts of defiance, was their answer to a problem as old as humanity itself. Death was never far from the Greeks. Life expectancy was short. Children often died before reaching adulthood. Wars between city-states flared constantly, and plagues swept through populations with terrifying speed. To live in ancient Greece was to live with the awareness that the boundary between life and death was thin and easily crossed. When a person died, the process of sending them to the afterlife began at home. Death was a domestic event. The body was washed, anointed with oils, and dressed by female relatives, usually the mother or sisters of the deceased. They closed the eyes and mouth, wrapped the body in fine cloth, and laid it out for viewing. This vigil, the prothesis, lasted up to 2 days. Family and neighbors came to mourn, often loudly and dramatically. Wailing, tearing hair, and striking the chest were common expressions of grief. Death was not hidden or sanitized. It was raw and communal. Offerings were placed with the dead. Food, drink, small possessions, sometimes weapons or jewelry. A coin might be put under the tongue or on the eyes. This was payment for Charon, the grim ferryman who rowed souls across the river Styx or Acheron to reach the realm of Hades. Without the coin, tradition said a soul might wander restlessly on the shores of death, unable to cross, once the body was prepared. A funeral procession, the ekphora, carried it to the burial site at dawn. Men walked silently. Women wailed and sang laments. The grave itself could be simple or elaborate, depending on wealth. A stone stele might be carved with the likeness of the dead or with symbols of their life. Wealthier families sometimes built small mausoleums. Poorer graves were marked with little more than a mound and pottery. But burial was not only about remembrance, it was about proper passage to the underworld. The Greeks believed the soul, the psyche, needed the right rituals to find its way. An unburied body was a tragedy. Without burial, a soul could become restless, a ghost haunting the living. This fear runs through Greek literature, from Sophocles' Antigone, where a sister risks death to bury her brother, to Homer's Iliad, where even enemies demand burial for fallen warriors. Once buried, the dead were honored with offerings, libations of wine, honey, milk, or oil poured onto the grave, sometimes accompanied by food or small sacrifices. These rituals were repeated at certain times of the year, keeping the connection between living and dead alive. Ancestors mattered. Neglecting them could invite their anger or misfortune. Yet for all this care, the underworld remained bleak. The rituals did not promise a better fate. They only secured passage. Hades accepted all souls. The ordinary Greek faced a future as a shade, faint and powerless, barely more than memory. This was the world of Homer. His epics reflect a culture where death was inevitable and grim, but also where remembrance could grant a kind of second life. Achilles chose glory because it outlived him. Funeral rites were sacred because they kept the dead from wandering. But hope of personal bliss after death was minimal. Still, death fascinated and frightened. Ghost stories were common. Shades could appear in dreams or haunt the living if angered or improperly buried. Necromancy, communicating with the dead, was known, though dangerous. Witches and oracles claimed to summon spirits for guidance. The boundary between worlds was porous, but dangerous to cross. Gradually, over the archaic and classical periods, cracks appeared in this grim consensus. New religious movements hinted that death might not be the end of joy. Poets and philosophers began to ask deeper questions. And small cults, private, often secretive, promised that with the right initiation, a soul might find peace beyond the shadows. One of the oldest shifts came from the story of Persephone. Daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain, she was abducted by Hades to be his queen. Demeter's grief withered the earth until Zeus forced a compromise. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld and part above. This myth explained the seasons, but it also introduced the idea that descent into Hades could be temporary. It planted a seed. Maybe death was not absolute. Maybe return was possible, at least for some. Another crack came from hero cults. Some mortals, after death, were worshipped as semi-divine. Heracles, for example, endured death and ascended to Olympus. These heroes blurred the line between mortal and immortal. Their stories hinted that exceptional lives could defy the ordinary fate of shades. But the most profound new hope came from the mystery cults. Chief among them were the Eleusinian mysteries, sacred to Demeter and Persephone. Each year, initiates traveled from Athens to Eleusis, reenacting the goddess's story in secret rites. We don't know all the details. Secrecy was enforced. But ancient sources agree the mysteries promised something extraordinary. A better fate after death. Initiates left with the conviction that they would not wander as empty shades but enjoy a blessed afterlife. Even great writers like Sophocles and Cicero spoke of the mysteries with reverence. For ordinary Greeks, this was revolutionary. It meant salvation was possible, not through social class or battlefield glory, but through personal initiation. The mysteries democratized hope. At the same time, another current of thought arose, the Orphic tradition. Rooted in the myth of Orpheus, who journeyed to the underworld to retrieve his wife Eurydice, Orphism taught that the soul was divine but trapped in a cycle of rebirth. Life was a kind of prison. Through purity and initiation, the soul could escape and return to a divine state. Orphic tablets buried with the dead gave them instructions, passwords, prayers, and directions to navigate Hades safely and reach a better destiny. These movements didn't erase the old fear of death, but they complicated it. By the 5th century BCE, Greece was a patchwork of beliefs. Farmers might still picture the grey halls of Hades. Poets might speak of Elysium. Philosophers debated whether the soul was immortal. Mystery cult initiates walked with secret hope. One of the first thinkers to philosophize death was Pythagoras. Famous now for geometry, he also taught that souls transmigrate, that after death they are reborn in new bodies, human or animal. This idea, shocking in Homer's day, would influence Plato deeply. Meanwhile, tragedy, the theater of Athens, grappled with death constantly. Plays like Euripides' Alcestis explored sacrifice and return from death. Sophocles' Antigone fought for burial as sacred duty. The stage became a place where society wrestled with mortality. And then came the philosophers of the classical age, who transformed the conversation. Socrates, as reported by Plato, treated death with calm curiosity. On the eve of his execution, he told friends that death was either a dreamless sleep or a chance to converse with past heroes and thinkers. Neither seemed frightening to him. Plato took this further. In dialogues like the Phaedo, he argued that the soul is immortal and that philosophy itself is preparation for death, a cleansing of the soul from the body's distractions. He described a moral afterlife, souls judged and sent to various realms according to their deeds. Virtuous souls could ascend. The wicked might be punished or reborn. For the first time in Greek thought, ethical life had clear consequences beyond the grave. This was a turning point. Homer's flat, fate-driven afterlife gave way to a moralized, individualized one. Yet ordinary religion remained complex. Farmers still poured libations for ancestors. Mystery cults still promised secret salvation. Ghost stories still frightened. Greece never had a single doctrine. It had layers, old and new, folk and philosophical, side by side. But the shift mattered. By the Hellenistic period, after Alexander the Great, personal salvation became a popular concern. New cults, influenced by Eastern religions, spread ideas of judgment and paradise. Philosophical schools like the Stoics and Epicureans offered very different answers. The Stoics spoke of rational acceptance and cosmic order. The Epicureans, famously, denied an afterlife altogether, teaching that death is nothing to fear because the soul dissolves. Where death is, we are not, Epicurus said. Through it all, one truth remained. The Greeks never stopped wrestling with mortality. Their ideas were not static dogma, but a long argument stretching from Homer's shades to Plato's immortality to Epicurus's calm nothingness. In daily life, death rituals remained vital. Families still buried their dead with care. Festivals like the Anthesteria honored spirits of the departed. Tombs were visited and offerings renewed. Even philosophers who doubted the afterlife kept the traditions. Social and familial duty ran deeper than belief. This is what makes the Greek story so human. They lived with death openly. They feared it, questioned it, invented ways to master it, but they never fully tamed it. They buried their dead with love, whispered secret hopes in dark temples, debated the soul in bright academies, and still poured wine for the ancestors each year. It is easy, looking back, to imagine the Greeks as confident pagans with neat myths. The reality was messier, more alive. They had no pope, no single sacred text. They had poets, philosophers, priests, and grieving mothers, all adding their voices to an unfinished conversation about what comes after. And perhaps that is why their ideas still speak to us. In our own ways, we too live with mixed beliefs. Science, religion, vague hopes, quiet fears. We tell stories, seek meaning, join movements, or try to accept the unknown. In that, we are closer to the Greeks than we think. By the 5th century BCE, Greece had reached a moment of deep intellectual ferment. The world that Homer imagined, where all mortals drifted to the same shadowed halls, was still part of the cultural fabric, but it no longer satisfied everyone. Too many forces were reshaping how Greeks thought about life and death. New forms of religion, growing city-states with complex politics, and a flowering of philosophy that prized reason but did not shy away from mystery. The most visible challenge to the old vision came from the mystery cults. Chief among them were the Eleusinian Mysteries, a secretive annual rite that attracted thousands, from poor farmers to kings and poets. These ceremonies, held in honor of Demeter and Persephone, promised not just agricultural renewal, but a transformed destiny after death. While their inner workings were closely guarded, what we know is striking. Initiates underwent a long preparation, fasting and cleansing, then participated in night rituals at the Telesterion, the great hall at Eleusis. They were shown sacred objects, heard powerful utterances, and performed acts meant to align them with the divine story of Demeter losing and regaining her daughter. Ancient writers who went through the mysteries often spoke in hushed reverence afterward. The historian Herodotus mentioned them. The tragedian Sophocles said those initiated were blessed both in life and after death. The Roman statesman Cicero later wrote that through Eleusis, people learned not only how to live with joy, but also how to die with hope. The promise was not fiery damnation for the uninitiated or paradise for the chosen, but something subtler and more personal, that death would not be mere shadow, that there was a brighter fate reserved for those who had seen and experienced the sacred rites. Parallel to Eleusis was the Orphic movement, a loose set of practices and texts inspired by Orpheus, the mythical musician who dared to enter Hades alive to rescue his beloved Eurydice. The Orphics taught that humans carried within them a divine spark, but that it was trapped in the body, bound by guilt from an ancient cosmic crime. Life was a trial and a purification. The soul, after death, might face cycles of rebirth until it achieved purity and returned to the divine. Archaeologists have found thin gold tablets buried with the dead, Orphic lamellae, engraved with instructions for navigating the underworld, which paths to avoid, what passwords to speak, how to drink from the right spring of memory rather than the waters of forgetfulness. These were practical travel guides for the soul, a far cry from Homer's passive shades. For many ordinary Greeks, such teachings were a revelation. Death no longer had to mean anonymous drifting. Through initiation, through secret knowledge, the soul might secure a better fate. Salvation became personal and attainable, though still shrouded in secrecy. Yet these movements remained alongside traditional rites. A family might honor ancestors with libations and still send a son to be initiated at Eleusis. Greek religion was additive, not exclusive. While cults whispered hope, philosophy thundered new questions. The sophists, intellectuals of the 5th century, challenged traditional myths altogether. They taught rhetoric and skeptical inquiry, sometimes hinting that the gods themselves were human inventions. Protagoras famously declared that he could not know whether the gods existed at all. Such doubt unsettled the old funerary world, but rarely replaced it. Most people still performed rituals whether or not they believed fully. Socrates, meanwhile, modeled a very different attitude. Facing death after his trial in Athens, he spoke with a calm that startled his friends. In Plato's Apology, he says death may be either a dreamless sleep or a passage to another place where he might converse with past heroes and thinkers. Either outcome, he insists, is nothing to fear. Socrates did not claim certain knowledge about the afterlife, but he treated death as a mystery not worth trembling before. Plato went further. In the Phaedo, a dialogue set on the day of Socrates' death, He presents death as the soul's liberation from the body. He argues that the soul is immortal, pre-exists birth, and survives after death to be judged and rewarded or punished according to its purity. In the myth of Eir from the Republic, he describes a soldier who dies, sees the cosmic order, and returns to tell how souls are judged, punished, and reborn. Good souls ascend to a brighter existence. Wicked ones face 1,000 years of suffering before being reborn. The choices souls make before reincarnation shape their next lives. This moralized, almost judicial afterlife was revolutionary compared to Homer's flat realm. It gave death a meaning tied to virtue and justice. Life became preparation for the soul's journey. Philosophy was the best training for death because it purified the mind from bodily distractions. But Plato's vision was not the only one. The followers of Pythagoras already taught reincarnation and purity codes. The Stoics, emerging later, saw the soul as part of a rational cosmic fire, but focused more on living in harmony with nature than on personal survival. The Epicureans rejected immortality altogether. The soul, they said, is material and dissolves at death. Death is nothing to us, Epicurus taught, because when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist. So by the late classical and early Hellenistic periods, Greece was intellectually fragmented but spiritually vibrant. One person might attend the Eleusinian mysteries, read Plato, and still pour wine for ancestors. Another might laugh at afterlife tales and follow Epicurus. Another might fear judgment and seek purity like an Orphic. There was no single Greek orthodoxy. This plurality created both tension and freedom. For the first time, personal choice mattered. In Homer's day, one's fate after death was fixed and bleak. Now, an Athenian citizen could decide to be initiated, to study philosophy, to scoff at myth, or to cling to old family rites. Death became a field of options, even if none came with certainty. It also created anxiety. If the afterlife could be better or worse, how could one be sure to choose correctly? Mystery cults promised salvation but were secret. Philosophers argued fiercely. Skeptics mocked both. Ordinary people were left with a mix of hope and doubt. The plays of the era showed this tension. Euripides often portrayed the underworld as uncertain and dangerous but occasionally breakable by love or cunning. Aristophanes mocked philosophers and mystics alike, suggesting that no one really knew what happened after death. Comedy and tragedy became a space to laugh or cry at the confusion. Meanwhile, the civic cults that bound city-states together, festivals for Athena, Apollo, Zeus, focused on life here and now, prosperity and communal identity. They rarely spoke directly about the soul's fate. The afterlife was a personal concern, pursued in private. This mix of public ritual and private quest is one of the most distinctive features of Greek religion. Unlike later Christian Europe, where church dogma would define salvation, Greece remained a patchwork of overlapping beliefs. You could honor Zeus at a festival, bury your dead with traditional rites, whisper Orphic prayers at your own funeral, and discuss Plato's metaphysics at dinner, all without contradiction. Hellenistic culture, after Alexander's conquests, added even more layers. Greek thought met Egyptian, Persian, and Eastern ideas. The ruler cults of the new monarchies promised divine favor and sometimes deified kings. Isis from Egypt and Serapis became popular gods with promises of personal salvation. Astrology rose as a way to predict fate beyond life. Philosophers like the Stoics and Epicureans offered cosmic serenity or fearless acceptance of death, appealing to people exhausted by political upheaval. One striking development was the growing sense of individual moral accountability. Even outside philosophy, funerary art began to depict the soul's journey, hinting at judgment or blessed fields. Tomb inscriptions shifted from mere name and memory to personal voices speaking to passers-by. I was like you. You will be like me. Enjoy life while you can. Others expressed hope for a brighter afterlife. Death became a mirror for the self. It's important to remember, though, that most Greeks were not full-time philosophers or mystics. Farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, they participated in what their families and communities did. They buried their dead with coins and libations. Some sought initiation at Eleusis if they could. Many simply lived, hoped vaguely, and feared as humans do. Yet this era, the classical and Hellenistic centuries, laid the intellectual foundation for later transformations. Rome would inherit Greek ideas about the soul and the afterlife. Early Christian thinkers, many trained in Greek philosophy, would adopt and adapt concepts of immortality, judgment, and moral consequence. Even our modern debates about death, whether it is nothingness, rebirth, or moral reckoning, echo those ancient conversations. But for the Greeks themselves, this diversity was lived, not systematized. Theirs was a spiritual marketplace without a single creed. In it, the old Homeric shades still drifted. But now, alongside the Orphic initiate armed with golden instructions, the Platonist soul-seeking purity, the Epicurean dismissing fear, and the Eleusinian hopeful of gentle fields beyond. It was a restless, searching time. Death was no longer just an ending, but a problem to be solved or at least faced with courage. And that shift, from resignation to exploration, was one of Greece's greatest intellectual legacies. By the 4th century BCE, Greek thought about death had reached a turning point. For centuries, the afterlife had been a dim, gray inevitability, a land of shades ruled by Hades where even the greatest heroes felt cheated. But the intellectual and spiritual revolution of the classical age had changed the conversation. Homer's world still lived on in poetry and ritual, yet now it sat beside powerful new ideas. That the soul might be judged, that virtue could shape one's fate, that mysteries and initiation could offer a brighter destiny, and that reason itself could banish fear. The most ambitious vision came from Plato. He inherited from his teacher Socrates the calm belief that death is not to be feared, but he built upon it an entire moral cosmos. In dialogues like the Phaedo, the Gorgias, and the Republic, Plato describes the soul as immortal and divine, temporarily housed in the body. Life, he argued, is a test. The soul arrives from a purer, eternal realm, becomes weighed down by bodily passions and ignorance, and must strive to return to its true nature. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, is training for death because it teaches the soul to detach from material distractions and seek truth and goodness. Plato gave this vision narrative power through myths. The most famous, the myth of Ir at the end of the Republic, tells of a soldier named Ir who falls in battle but revives on his funeral pyre, reporting what he saw beyond. It describes a vast cosmic plane where judges assign souls to ascend toward the heavens or descend into punishment below. After 1,000 years of reward or suffering, souls return to choose their next life. Some pick foolishly, drawn by power or pleasure. Others choose wisely, seeking justice or quiet virtue. Then the souls drink from the river of forgetfulness and are reborn. This myth does not claim literal truth, but it teaches that actions have eternal consequences and that wisdom protects the soul from bad choices. In other works, Plato refines the picture. In the Phaedo, Socrates tells his friends that true philosophers welcome death because it releases the soul to the pure realm of forms. The good and just, he says, will dwell with the gods. The impure may face further cycles of rebirth or punishment. In the Gorgias, he envisions judges sorting naked souls stripped of worldly rank, rewarding justice and punishing tyranny. Here, for the first time in Greek thought, ethical life clearly shapes the afterlife. This was a dramatic departure from Homer's underworld, where Achilles regretted his glorious death and where kings and cowherds alike wandered as faint ghosts. Plato's moralized cosmos gave meaning to virtue and hope to those who sought wisdom. It also suggested that ordinary life, choices about justice, temperance, courage, had cosmic significance. A poor man who lived well might fare better after death than a cruel king. Yet Plato's ideas did not erase older practices. Families still prepared their dead with the same care. Washing, anointing, wrapping, placing coins for Charon, pouring libations at the grave. Tombs were still visited on anniversaries. Ancestors were still honored. Plato himself never told people to abandon these rituals. He reinterpreted them. Death, he said, deserved dignity because the soul was precious and on a long journey. While Plato built an intellectual system, the mystery cults continued to thrive in a more emotional and ritual mode. The Eleusinian mysteries remained one of the greatest religious experiences available to a Greek. Each year, thousands walked the sacred way from Athens to Eleusis, reenacting the grief of Demeter and the return of Persephone. Fasting, purification, and sacred drama prepared them for the climactic moment when initiates were shown holy objects and spoken secret words. Ancient authors described the experience as life-changing. Aristophanes hinted at joy and laughter. Sophocles wrote that the initiated alone could hope for happiness beyond the grave. Cicero, centuries later, would call it the greatest gift Athens gave the world. What exactly the mysteries promised is still debated, but the emotional impact is clear. Participants believed that they had touched something divine and secured a gentler afterlife. Unlike Plato's austere intellectual path, Eleusis offered visceral reassurance through ritual and myth. It It did not demand philosophical purity. It invited ordinary people to share in a cosmic drama of loss and renewal. Parallel to Eleusis, the Orphic tradition provided a more esoteric route. Orphics lived by purity rules, vegetarianism, and secret hymns. They believed the soul was divine but imprisoned because of a primeval crime. Some said humanity was born from the ashes of the titan Dionysus Zagreus, punished for rebellion. Life was a cycle of rebirth meant to purify the soul until it could escape to divine bliss. Orphic initiates were buried with gold tablets inscribed with instructions. Avoid the spring of Lethe, which brings forgetfulness. Drink instead from Mnemosyne, the spring of memory. Declare, I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone. These texts read like travel guides for the afterlife, a striking contrast to Homer's passive shades. To an ancient Greek, these options could coexist. A family might send a son to Eleusis, keep Orphic tablets for burial, study Plato, and still sacrifice at local festivals. Greek religion was not about exclusive creeds, but about weaving multiple layers of practice and belief. Not everyone welcomed this new, moralized, hope-filled vision. Some intellectuals resisted or reinterpreted it. The sophists treated myth and ritual as cultural constructs. Protagoras famously declared, concerning the gods, I cannot know whether they exist or not. Such skepticism could undercut fear of Hades but offered little comfort. More radically, the Epicureans denied immortality entirely. Epicurus, teaching in Athens around 300 BCE, argued that everything, including the soul, is made of atoms. At death, the atoms disperse. There is no consciousness, no punishment, no reward. Fear of death, he said, poisons life. Death is nothing to us, for when we exist, death is not present. And when death is present, we do not exist. His goal was peace of mind, to free humans from terror of the gods and the afterlife so they could seek simple pleasures and friendship. The Stoics, another Hellenistic school, took a middle path. They saw the universe as governed by rational divine order, the Logos. The soul, too, was part of this cosmic reason. Some Stoics believed the soul survives until the next cosmic cycle. Others thought it dissolves sooner. But they agreed that death is natural and not to be feared. Virtue, not afterlife hope, gives life meaning. The wise person lives according to reason and accepts death with calm. So by the late classical and Hellenistic periods, Greeks faced a spectrum: Homeric shadows, Platonic judgment, Eleusinian and Orphic salvation, Epicurean nothingness, Stoic acceptance, skeptical doubt, and imported cults promising eternal life. No central authority forced a single answer. Each individual could choose or combine what resonated. This variety was reflected in art and daily life. Tomb reliefs still showed family scenes, but now sometimes hinted at individual destiny. The dead greeted by Persephone, the soul's journey suggested in imagery. Inscriptions spoke more personally. Some warned, I was like you. You will be like me. Enjoy your life. Others expressed hope. Farewell. We shall meet again. The shift from communal memory to individual voice shows how personal the afterlife had become. Even within families, generations might differ. A grandfather content with Homer's Hades might have a grandson carrying an Orphic tablet. A father might follow Plato. A son might laugh with Epicurus. Yet all would gather for the same funeral rites, pour the same libations, and visit the same tomb. This pluralism did not weaken Greek culture. It gave it resilience. It let philosophy thrive without severing tradition. It let private hope bloom without destroying public ritual. It let doubt coexist with reverence. It made death an open field of exploration. The Hellenistic age after Alexander's conquests only widened the field. As Greek culture blended with Egyptian and Near Eastern traditions, new gods and salvation cults entered the mix. Isis and Serapis promised personal protection and eternal life to their devotees. Astrology gained prestige, offering charts of destiny and hints about soul fate. Ruler cults deified kings, blurring divine and human. Mystery religions proliferated, each with its own rituals of cleansing, rebirth, and post-mortem bliss. Amid this spiritual marketplace, Greek philosophical schools became more practical. The Stoics taught inner freedom through reason. The Epicureans cultivated serene friendship and fearlessness. Skeptics suspended judgment on all things, including the afterlife, to achieve peace. Salvation could be found not only in gods, but in mental mastery. For ordinary people, choice could be comforting or dizzying. There was no single map of death, only many paths. Yet one theme bound them: the refusal to leave death as meaningless. Whether through Plato's cosmic justice, Eleusis' secret hope, Orphic liberation, or Epicurean calm. The Greeks insisted that how one lived and how one faced death mattered. This was the climax of their long struggle with mortality. A culture that began with Homer's flat shadows had produced some of the most influential visions of the soul ever imagined. Plato's immortal, judged soul would shape Christian and Islamic theology. Epicurus's fearless materialism would echo in modern secularism. The mystery cults would prefigure baptism and initiation. Even the Stoic call to live virtuously without fear of death still inspires today. Yet for the Greeks themselves, there was no final dogma. A man might die with a coin under his tongue for Charon, an Orphic tablet on his chest, and Plato's words in his memory. Another might die laughing, convinced like Epicurus that nothing awaits. Another might die serene, having walked the sacred way to Eleusis. All were still Greek. All were part of a culture that accepted that no single answer was enough. It is this multiplicity, this intellectual courage and spiritual inventiveness that made the Greek approach to death so enduring. They took the most terrifying human fact and built around it not one fortress but many. Poetry, ritual, philosophy, secret hope, and calm acceptance. They left us not certainty but a toolbox, and at the center of it all still loomed Hades, silent and inevitable. No matter how one prepared, through philosophy, mystery, or denial, the journey would pass through his realm. But the Greeks taught that how you walk into that darkness can differ. Afraid or fearless, ignorant or wise, alone or bearing secret words, nameless or remembered. By the time Plato's ideas, the mystery cults, and the new philosophical schools had spread across the Greek world, the practical experience of death for ordinary people remained deeply traditional. Whatever a person believed about the soul's ultimate fate, funerals, graves, and yearly remembrance still shaped family life. If the great intellectual battles of the classical and Hellenistic ages gave new ways to imagine what happened beyond the grave, they did not erase the old duties of mourning. Death began at home, as it had for centuries. Women washed and prepared the body, anointed it with oils, wrapped it in clean cloth, and laid it out for the prothesis, the wake. The house filled with laments, cries, and songs of grief. Friends and neighbors came to mourn, just as they had in Homer's time. Coins were still placed with the dead, for Charon's passage remained a universal symbol. Libations of honey, wine, milk, or oil were poured. Even a philosopher who doubted the literal ferryman would not risk dishonoring custom. The funeral procession, the ekphora, wound through the city at dawn. The grave was prepared with care. A stele or marker was raised. These rituals were more than habit. They anchored families in continuity. A man might study Epicurus and believe the soul dissolves, but he still honored his father's tomb. A mother might hope Eleusis promised her child a gentle afterlife, but still mourned publicly and visited the grave on anniversaries. Death was communal and emotional, even when intellectual belief shifted. Festivals helped keep the dead present in civic life. In Athens, the Anthesteria, a springtime festival, honored spirits returning briefly to the living world. Families left offerings, cleaned graves, and performed small rites to keep restless ghosts at peace. Other cities had similar days when the barrier between living and dead was acknowledged. The world might have been intellectually fragmented, but everyone accepted that the dead lingered in memory and deserved respect. Grave monuments changed with the new age. Early simple markers gave way to elaborate stelae carved with scenes of domestic tenderness. A father shaking hands with his son, a mother embracing her child, a warrior saying farewell. These images were not just memorial. They reflected a new sense of personal destiny. Inscriptions sometimes carried voices of the dead, speaking directly to the passerby. Stranger, stop and mourn, for I was as you are. Others boasted of virtue or hinted at hope. I have gone to the blessed. Some echoed philosophy. Death is nothing to us. The variety shows how public memory absorbed the intellectual diversity of the time. Philosophy itself offered tools for grief. Epicureans counseled that death should not be feared because it is nothing. Stoics reminded mourners that death is natural and the soul returns to the cosmic order. Platonists saw death as liberation for the virtuous. But none of these schools denied the pain of loss. Rather, they sought to discipline it. A Stoic might grieve but strive to keep sorrow within reason. An Epicurean might accept death's finality but cherish the pleasure of memories. Mystery cults provided different comfort. Initiates of Eleusis or Dionysian groups often faced death with quiet hope. Their funerals might include secret symbols or phrases hinting at initiation. Orphic tablets with instructions for the underworld were sometimes slipped into graves. To outsiders, these might seem small charms. To the faithful, they were passports to a better fate. This interplay of old custom and new hope made Greek death culture layered but coherent. One could fulfill every social and familial duty while privately holding a very different picture of what awaited beyond. Religion was not about exclusive belief, but about right practice and personal search. Over time, Greek ideas about the soul and afterlife began to influence and be influenced by Rome. As Rome expanded, it absorbed Greek philosophy and religion. Educated Romans read Plato and Epicurus. Roman mystery cults borrowed heavily from Eleusis and Dionysus. The cult of Isis and Serapis, already popular in Hellenistic Greece, became fashionable in Rome. Romans adopted the idea of a morally significant afterlife, even as traditional Roman religion had focused mostly on family spirits and civic ritual. Funerary art in the Roman period often shows this blending. Greek myth scenes like Persephone's return alongside Roman virtues and personal epitaphs. Some tombs show Orphic imagery. Others quote Epicurean serenity. The moralized, personal afterlife had become part of Mediterranean culture. These currents also prepared the ground for early Christianity. When Christian missionaries reached Greek-speaking cities, they found people already used to the idea of individual salvation, initiation, and moral judgment after death. Plato's immortal soul, Orphic rebirth, Eleusinian hope, and Isis's promise of eternal life created a spiritual environment where the Christian message could take root. Christian baptism and communion echoed mystery cult initiation. Christian heaven and hell drew on Platonic judgment and moral order. The language of soul and immortality that became central to Christian theology was deeply shaped by centuries of Greek debate. Yet it would be a mistake to think the Greeks themselves ever settled on one true picture. Even late into the Roman era, the old rituals continued. Coins for Charon were still found in graves. Families still poured libations. Philosophers still argued. Skeptics still doubted. The multiplicity endured. This endurance shows something fundamental about Greek culture. It valued practice and tradition even when belief shifted. One could bury the dead with Homeric rites, join a mystery cult, study Plato, and still call oneself Greek. There was no central authority to enforce orthodoxy, and perhaps that freedom kept the culture vibrant. It also shows why their confrontation with death remains relevant. The Greeks faced mortality without a single revelation or prophet to settle the matter. They built many answers, some poetic, some ritual, some rational, some hopeful. They accepted uncertainty, but refused despair. In daily life, this meant people could grieve and hope at once. A father might tell his son the soul lives on with the gods, but still hire mourners to cry loudly at the funeral. A mother might whisper Orphic passwords over a child's grave while attending civic festivals for Demeter. A philosopher might speak calmly of nothingness yet still honor his ancestors. This blending feels modern because it is. Humans rarely live by one clean belief about death. It also meant death remained visible. Unlike many later cultures that tried to hide or sanitize dying, the Greeks kept it in the home, in art, in public spaces. Children saw funerals. Families tended graves. Festivals recalled the dead. Mortality was part of civic identity and family memory. It was feared, yes, but not banished. This visibility shaped their creativity. Great tragedies wrestled with death's meaning. Comedies mocked it. Philosophy treated it as the ultimate test of wisdom. Mystery religions turned it into a rite of passage. Poets and sculptors filled cemeteries with images of farewell and hope. Death drove Greek thought as much as love or politics. By the late Hellenistic age, with Rome rising, Greek attitudes toward death were both sophisticated and deeply human. They had built a moral cosmos through Plato, practical serenity through Epicurus and the Stoics, ritual hope through Eleusis and Orphism, and an enduring culture of remembrance through family and festival. They had not eliminated fear, but they had learned to live with it and to shape it. This, perhaps, was their greatest legacy. Later ages often tried to impose a single story, heaven and hell, salvation or nothingness. The Greeks showed another way, a plural, searching culture where reason, ritual, and art could all face mortality together. They taught that fear of death can be met by many tools: philosophy to reason with it, ritual to give comfort, community to share grief, art to make memory last. Their world reminds us that there is no single correct human response to death. Some need mystery and hope, some need logic and acceptance, some need tradition and memory. The Greeks lived all these paths at once. Stand for a moment among the ruins of an ancient Greek cemetery. Marble stelae lean in the sun, carved with gentle scenes. A mother handing a child to a servant, a young man shaking hands with his father, a warrior saying goodbye. Their faces are calm, not triumphant. Death came early for many of them, yet the stone preserves their love and dignity. Pour a libation on the earth, and you have done what a Greek would have done 2,000 years ago. The dead are still honored. Memory still speaks. Behind those quiet graves lies a restless, searching mind. The Greeks never stopped asking what death means. They began with Homer's bleak house of Hades, a shadow world where even Achilles longed for life. They built rituals to guide the soul safely there and to keep it from wandering. Then they invented hope. Through Demeter and Persephone, they imagined return and renewal. Through Orpheus, they dreamed of escaping death's grip. Through Eleusis, they found comfort in sacred drama and initiation. Through philosophers, they tested every idea, that the soul is eternal and judged, that it returns in new bodies, that it simply dissolves. No single answer ever won, but the asking itself changed the world. Plato's vision of an immortal, moral soul would travel far. His idea that the just are rewarded and the wicked punished shaped later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries, rituals of cleansing and rebirth, echo in Christian baptism and communion. The Stoic call to live well and fear nothing inspired thinkers from Marcus Aurelius to modern self-help. Epicurus's calm refusal to dread death still comforts secular minds. Even the simple Homeric lesson, that glory and memory outlive the body, lingers in how we honor names and achievements. Yet Greek culture never demanded that one path be correct. A farmer could still believe in shades and honor ancestors. A soldier could join Eleusis. A philosopher could seek reasoned serenity. All could share the same funerals and festivals. Death remained a community event even when private belief diverged. This pluralism is one of Greece's quietest but most profound gifts. It showed that human beings can live with uncertainty about the afterlife without losing dignity, tradition, or depth. It also showed that fear of death can produce greatness. Greek art, theater, philosophy, and religion were all, in some way, responses to mortality. Achilles' choice of glory over long life became an enduring meditation on meaning. Tragedy, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, turned grief into insight. Philosophy turned dread into inquiry. Mystery rites turned anxiety into hope. Instead of hiding from death, the Greeks made it a source of culture. There is a lesson here for us. We live in an age of competing stories about death. Scientific materialism, religious faiths, vague spirituality, and quiet doubt. We often hide death away, medicalize it, avoid speaking of it. The Greeks did the opposite. They faced it publicly, talked about it, argued about it, and built rituals to hold its weight. They never found certainty, but they found ways to live fully under mortality's shadow. Consider the figures who have guided us through this story. Achilles, who chose a short, glorious life because he feared forgotten shadow. Orpheus, who braved Hades for love and taught that the soul can journey on. Socrates, who drank hemlock with calm curiosity. Plato, who built an invisible moral universe. Epicurus, who freed people by saying there is nothing to fear. The anonymous farmers and mothers who buried their dead with care, whispered prayers, and poured wine year after year. Each faced the same unknown. Each found a path. If we stand back, we see a long arc, from resignation to exploration to moral imagination. Homer accepted death as flat and inevitable. Mystery cults cracked that wall with ritual hope. Plato and later philosophers gave it reason and justice. Others rejected fear altogether. By the end of antiquity, death had become a field of thought rather than a single destiny. That intellectual freedom still shapes us. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Greeks never abandoned the simplest truth. To be human is to mourn and remember. Coins for Charon, libations for ancestors, festivals for the dead. These acts endured through every debate. Philosophy might explain, mystery might promise, but the living still gathered at the grave. The dead were not ideas. They were fathers, mothers, children, friends. Memory kept them close when doctrine could not. So what do we do with this inheritance? Perhaps we can learn to hold mortality with the same layered wisdom. We can reason with it, seek meaning in it, build rituals to comfort us, and still love and honor the dead without claiming final knowledge. We can admit that no single story satisfies everyone, and that's fine. What matters is the search, the care, and the courage to look death in the face. If you listen closely, the Greek voices echo. Achilles warning that glory is fleeting. Socrates smiling at the unknown. Orphic tablets whispering secret paths. Plato urging the soul toward justice. Epicurus telling you not to fear. None cancel the others. They are a chorus. In the end, what the Greeks really believed about the afterlife was never one thing. It was a spectrum, shadow and silence, rebirth and memory, judgment and bliss, calm nothingness. But beneath all these theories was a single enduring act: to live fully now, to honor the dead with dignity, and to keep asking what it means to die. Perhaps that is their most lasting wisdom. Death may stay mysterious, but the way we face it, curious, creative, communal, can be ours to choose.